Arriving in Fort Atkinson as a young woman in 1868, Mary Frances Cole was destined to leave her mark on the literary, intellectual, and civic life of the young community. Born in 1841 in Jackson, Michigan, she started teaching at the age of 17. In 1861, she went out to Massachusetts to study at Mount Holyoke College for Women. She then returned to Jackson, where she taught in the high school. In 1866, her family moved to Ripon, Wisconsin, and she went with them. She became an English instructor at Ripon College while there. 2 years later, she came here to Fort Atkinson to teach in the high school under Professor Purdy. It was here in Fort Atkinson that Mary met Milo C. Jones II, the son of Milo C. Jones, one of the very first settlers here in Fort Atkinson and a prominent community member. They met when Mary tutored Milo for his application to West Point. But he became so taken with her that he changed his plans, stayed in Fort Atkinson, and 2 years later, they were married. The Jefferson County Daily Union gave the couple their heartiest congratulations and wishes for a life filled with more than the usual amount of happiness. Once married, she was known as Mrs. Milo C. Jones, as was customary at the time. This is Mary's wedding dress, which is part of the collection of the Horde Historical Museum. And you can see that it has these wonderful sleeves. They were popular during the Civil War, but Mary chose, even though she was married in 1870 and they were kind of out of fashion then, to use this kind of a design on her wedding dress. Remember, this dress now is 150 years old. The museum also has her wedding shoes, which are just beautiful with the laces on the side. They're made out of fabric and they have these little heels. So this was how Mary looked on her wedding day. I'm now standing in front of the old Jones family farmhouse, which was built by Mary's father-in-law in 1844 and which still stands on the family property. It is this house that is seen in the Jones Dairy Farm advertising and publicity because it is now owned by Jones Dairy Farm, the family business. All of her married life was spent in this home, though it was much smaller when Mary moved in. When Mary Frances Cole marries Milo Cornelius in 1870, there were 12 people living in this house, including her husband's mother and father. It also had 11 outside doors, because in those days, windows were taxed more heavily than doors. So people put in doors for ventilation in order to save money on their taxes. Mary kept up the home's reputation for hospitality, which had been established by her mother-in-law, Mary, who was an excellent cook. And it was in this house that Mary raised their 3 children, Edward, Philip, and Mary. With her liberal education and keen analytical mind, Mary became a leader in the literary activities of Fort Atkinson and supported every community betterment effort. A pioneer in the Women's Club movement, in 1881, she became a founder of Tuesday Club, a women's study club, the first of its kind in Wisconsin, and which is now celebrating its 139th year. She was also a founder of the Fort Atkinson chapter of the DAR. Her contributions to club work were an inspiration to all. Mary wrote poems, stories, and articles which were published in places like Outlook, a weekly family periodical published in New York, and in Youth's Companion, an American children's magazine, and in leading newspapers. I'd like to share with you one of Mary's poems where she writes about memory. A shy, sad stranger sits with us today and softly calls each unforgotten name. She knots the weaving colors of our life into one web where sunlight strives with rain, whispering to hope the ending of the strife. Spirit of bygone time and time to be, this is thy hour, we hail thee, memory. Mary's health failed about 15 years before her death, but with her strong spirit she bore her suffering patiently, even as she became an invalid. She died in 1921, with her funeral held here in the family home. The Jefferson County Daily Union eulogized her, saying, "Fort Atkinson loses another of its pioneers and also a woman of exceptional ability whose influence did much toward shaping the intellectual life of our city. There is no woman who has passed from our community to the great beyond whose memory will be more fondly cherished and revered than hers." Even accounting for the flowery language of the day, it is very obvious that Mary was well thought of. Her husband, Milo C. Jones II, often called young Milo by the old residents to distinguish him from his father, was one of 8 children and a surveyor like his father, and his son Edward after him. He ran the family dairy farm and says he got into the sausage business almost accidentally after severe rheumatism made physical labor very difficult. He said it occurred to him when he was watching the butchering from his room that they could make a little sausage to sell, using the Vermont recipe of his mother Sally, the same recipe they had been making sausage from for their own use for over 30 years. Milo's neighbors, who were his first customers, passed the word. The sausage was first made on the kitchen stove in this house. Mary's contribution was making the little cloth bags that held the sausage. Their son Edward, a Cornell graduate, saw the possibilities of this endeavor, and with his father and the rest of the family began in 1889 to build up the business we now know as Jones Dairy Farm. As mentioned earlier, Mary's father-in-law Milo was one of Jefferson County's first settlers coming to what would become Wisconsin from Vermont to work as a surveyor. He left his wife Sally and their 2 children back in Vermont a situation that made Sally, whom he had married in 1832, quite unhappy. In 1838, he went back to pick up Sally and the children. Over the years, he served as village president, postmaster, justice of the peace, and when the village of Fort Atkinson decided to become a city, he served as their first mayor. In 1848, he built the city's first hotel, the Green Mountain House, which he ran until 1855. The story goes that his rambunctious twins, who were 4 years old at the time, got into the basement of the hotel and opened up the spigots on the barrels of things like molasses and whiskey and vinegar, and you can imagine what kind of a mess it made. So he took them by the hand, went to see Sally, and said, "I don't know about you, but I'm going back to the farm." And he did come back here and continued dairy production. Sally, Mary's mother-in-law, was often called Aunt Sally, and she was famed as a good cook. She was also known for doing things like taking food to the train station to give to the young men who were going off to fight in the Civil War. As I said, she was a great cook, and it was her recipe that was developed into the sausage product of Jones Dairy Farm that we still enjoy today. This is a blanket that Sally brought with her from Vermont in 1838. This is part of the Hoard Historical Museum's collection. I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about Mary Cole Jones. As you can see, Mary enriched the life of the Fort Atkinson community, and the Jones family must have been very pleased to call her one of their own.